Entry 11, the Duke's choice. They auctioned the debtor's daughter. The War Duke of Harthmere paid double and told them why. Engine *B. Sold forced contract right arrow rescued or love. Narrator * the Duke's closest friend, Lord Callum Braith, a baron. Heroine * Miss Alara Voss, a debtor's daughter, quiet and dignified. Duke * the War Duke of Harthmere, Lord Renwick Hale, Duke of Harthmere. Setting * a marriage auction at Whitmore Hall / country, estate of Harthmere. Ending * the forced match became true love. He paid double and claimed her before them all. Mood * protective, brooding then tender. Seed mood, the young Victoria. A woman thrust into a world of powerful men who want to control her, her quiet inner steel. The one protector whose loyalty is fierce and real. Word count target * 11, 200 words. I have told this story only once before to my wife, on the night she asked me why I wept at Renwick's wedding. She deserved the truth, and so do you, though I confess the telling still costs me something. I was there for all of it. I watched the auction. I watched the girls stand still as stone while grown men placed their bids. And I watched Renwick Hale, the War Duke of Harthmere, a man who had walked through cannon fire without blinking, go very, very quiet in a way that I had only ever seen him go quiet before battle. That quiet was the most dangerous thing in the room. Let me begin where all such stories begin, with debt, and with men who believe that debt entitles them to everything. Lord Aldous Voss had been a charming fool for the better part of 40 years. He was not a wicked man, that at least I can say without dishonesty. Wicked men tend to know what they are doing and proceed with calculation. Aldous Voss was the more particularly English kind of ruin, the man who means well in every moment and plans nothing beyond the next season, who laughs too readily and is trusted too easily, and who genuinely, until the final accounting, believes that something will come right. He had gambled at cards, he had gambled at horses, and finally, in the autumn of his last season, he had gambled at something he called a business venture, which his creditors called by the plainer name of theft. He had gambled at cards, he had gambled at horses, and finally, in the autumn of his last season, he had gambled at something he called a business venture, which his creditors called by the plainer name of theft. When the accounts were settled and the estate stripped and the lawyers departed, Lord Voss was left with two things: a name that still carried the faint echo of respectability and a daughter. Miss Alara Voss was 23 years old at the time I first saw her. She was not the sort of woman who entered a room and silenced it. She was small in stature and quiet in manner, with dark hair dressed plainly and eyes the color of winter sky, gray with the suggestion of blue, calm in a way that spoke not of emptiness but of discipline. She had learned, I think, very early in her father's household that stillness was armor, that if you did not flinch, they could not see where to aim. I knew none of this when I arrived at Whitmore Hall on the morning of the 4th of November. I had come at Renwick's invitation, or rather at his instruction. He did not issue invitations so much as he issued facts, and the fact was that Lord Cyrus Whitmore was hosting a gathering of gentlemen at his estate in the country, and Renwick wished me present. When I asked why, he said only, "Because I may need a witness." That was the kind of answer Renwick gave. I had known him since we were boys at school, and in all that time he had never once said more than was necessary. The War Duke of Harthmere was not a talkative man. He was tall, broad through the shoulder in the way that men who have survived campaigns tend to become, not from vanity, but from the simple fact that war shapes the body as a forge shapes iron. He had a scar along his jaw from a cavalry engagement near the border, and he carried himself with the ease of a man who has learned that he is the most dangerous person in any given room, and finds the knowledge neither pleasant nor particularly interesting. Society was afraid of him. I was not, because I had watched him nurse a wounded horse through the night once, murmuring to it in the dark, and a man who does that cannot frighten me. I had also, over our 30 years of friendship, been the recipient of his unwavering loyalty in circumstances I need not detail here, and seen him quietly manage crises that would have broken lesser men, without acknowledgement, without credit, without the slightest suggestion that he expected gratitude. He was simply the kind of man who did what needed doing and then went home and got on with things, and if you were his friend, you discovered this by observation rather than by announcement. What I did not understand, arriving at Whitmore Hall on that gray November morning, was precisely what we had come to witness. The house was pleasant, Whitmore had money and some taste, and the estate was well maintained. but there was something in the quality of the gathering that I noticed from the first hour. The men invited were all of a certain type, and they arrived with a certain air, and the servants moved in a particular way that suggested the household had been preparing for an event that required managing rather than simply a visit. Lord Cyrus Whitmore explained it himself over port, with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has devised something very clever. He was a stout, florid-faced man in his late 50s, with the cheerful ruthlessness that sometimes develops in men who have always had money and have consequently never needed to examine themselves too carefully. "The situation," he said, settling his glass, "is really quite practical. Voss owes debts across half the county. His creditors have agreed to consolidate. I hold the largest portion of the note, and the arrangement allows him to discharge the whole of it in one stroke." He smiled at the assembled gentlemen. There were 7 of us in the room, counting myself and Rennick. "His daughter is of marriageable age and has, I am told, no other prospects. The family name still carries some weight. Whoever takes her gains a wife of tolerable breeding. Voss's debts are cleared. Everyone is satisfied." I remember the precise quality of the silence that followed this. Then one of the other men, a young Lord Pemberton with too much inheritance and too little sense, said, "And what are the terms?" "A sealed bid," Whitmore said. "Each gentleman submits his figure. The highest bid retires the full note. The winner takes Miss Voss to wife within the month. Her father signs the consent this evening." I looked at Rennick. He was looking at his port glass. His expression had not changed. That was the quiet I mentioned, the pre-battle quiet. I had last seen it in a farmhouse in the countryside, the night before a skirmish that went badly for the other side. "And Miss Voss?" I heard myself ask. Whitmore glanced at me with mild surprise, as though I had asked whether the furniture had been consulted. "She is aware of the arrangement," he said. That was not an answer. I noted that it was not an answer. I did not sleep well that night. The house was pleasant enough. Whitmore kept a fine table, but there was something about the gathering that sat badly with me, like a meal taken too quickly. The men at dinner had talked about Miss Voss the way they talked about a promising piece of land, what she was worth, what she might yield, whether the location was convenient. I found Rennick on the terrace after midnight, which was not unusual. He rarely slept before 2 in the morning, a habit formed in the field where the night hours were for thinking. "You knew what this was before we came," I said. It was not a question. "I received a letter," he said. "From Voss's solicitor of all people. The man was distressed." He described the arrangement and asked if anyone of standing might intervene. Rennick turned his glass in his hand. "I do not generally intervene in other men's affairs, Callum. And yet here we are. And yet here we are." I leaned on the balustrade and looked at the dark grounds below. "You intend to bid." "I intend to bid enough that no one else's bid matters." He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without drama, as though it were simply a logistical fact. "She should not be sold to Pemberton or to any of the others." "You haven't even spoken to her." "No, a pause, have you?" I had not. I told him so. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She sat at dinner and she did not flinch once. Not when Whitmore made his remarks about the arrangement. Not when Pemberton looked at her the way he did. She ate her soup and spoke when spoken to with perfect composure." He stopped. "I have seen soldiers break under less." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. "I will not make her life worse than it already is," Rennick said. "That is all. It is a practical matter." He went inside. I stayed on the terrace for a long time, thinking about the word practical, and how often, in my experience, men used it to describe things that were not practical at all. I saw Miss Voss the following morning, properly, by which I mean we were introduced, and I was able to speak to her beyond the formal arrangement of the dinner table. She was walking in the east garden, alone, which struck me as brave under the circumstances. A less composed woman might have kept to her room or to her father's side. Ilara Voss walked in the garden as though it were any ordinary November morning, and she had no particular interest in what the day held. I excused myself from the gentlemen's conversation. They were already speculating with cheerful callousness about which of them would carry the bid, and went out through the east door. "Miss Voss," I said and bowed. "Forgive the intrusion, Lord Callum Braith of Braith Hall. I am a friend of the Duke of Harthmere." She looked at me steadily. Her eyes were, close up, precisely as I had described them, that gray that carries winter light, calm and very awake. "Lord Braith," she said, and curtsied with a grace that was entirely natural. "No performance. I know the name. You were at the Harcourt dinner last spring." "I was," I said, surprised. "You have a good memory." "I find it useful." She paused. "You are wondering whether you ought to apologize for being here, or whether that would merely draw attention to what you believe I already know." I blinked. The faintest trace of something, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin, moved at the corner of her mouth. "Forgive me," she said. "I have found directness more efficient than pretense lately. There is a great deal of pretense at Whitmore Hall." "There is," I agreed, recovering myself. Are you quite all right, Miss Voss?" She considered the question with what I can only describe as scrupulous honesty. "I am not frightened," she said. "I think perhaps I ought to be, and my composure at this moment may simply be that I have not yet fully apprehended the reality of the situation." A pause. "Or perhaps it is that I decided some weeks ago that there are certain things I cannot alter and I see no profit in anguish over them. I would rather think clearly." "And what does thinking clearly tell you?" She looked at me for a moment. "That several of the gentlemen gathered here are men I would find very difficult to respect, and that a life built on contempt for one's husband would be a wretched thing for everyone involved." She folded her hands together in front of her, a gesture of careful stillness. "It also tells me that one of the gentlemen present is not like the others. He did not look at me at dinner the way the others did." I did not ask which gentleman she meant. I thought I knew. "He is a good man," I said. "The best I know, and I am not easily impressed." She nodded once as though filing the information. "I thought so," she said. "He looked at me as though I were a person." She said it very quietly and without self-pity, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. She excused herself shortly after and walked back towards the house, and I stood in the east garden for quite some time before I could bring myself to go back inside. I was thinking about what she had said, that he looked at her as though she were a person, and about how little that should cost a man, and how rarely it was paid. I had been to a great many gatherings in my years, and I had watched men look at women in a variety of ways, none of them particularly flattering. There was the look of assessment of a mare at market, of land being valued for its yield. There was the look of possession when a man had already decided. There was the social look, which acknowledged presence without admission. And then, rarely, there was the other kind, the look that sees. That recognizes the mind behind the eyes and is struck by it, surprised or unsettled or simply attentive. Rennick had given her the last one. I had noticed it at dinner the night before, without fully understanding what I was seeing. He had said almost nothing to her directly. They had not been seated near enough for conversation. But twice I had caught him looking toward her end of the table, not the sideways proprietary glance that men gave women they considered theirs, but a direct and considering attention, as though he were listening to something she was communicating without words. She had, as she said, not flinched. But I had watched her eat her soup, and I had watched the precise, disciplined stillness of her hands, and I had thought, this woman is spending a great deal of energy on composure, not for vanity, for survival. I went back inside and found Rennick in the billiard room, not playing billiards, holding a cue and looking out the window at the grounds. "She corrected the solicitor's clause," I said, "in the document." He turned to look at me. I didn't hear what she said, but she pointed to a clause and he amended it. I paused. She read the whole document first. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I asked Whitmore's man afterward. He said she caught an ambiguity in the income provisions, something that could have been read to mean she had no independent claim to household funds after the marriage. She asked for it to be made explicit." He set the cue down. "The solicitor told me he had drafted the clause and she was correct." "She was protecting herself," I said, "with the only tool she had." "Yes," he looked back at the window. "She will not need to protect herself from me." He said it simply, without grandeur, the way he said things that he meant entirely and considered obvious. "She doesn't know that yet," I said. "No," he agreed. "She will have to learn it." "That is reasonable." I thought about the word reasonable and about what it meant, coming from a man who had just arranged to pay double the outstanding note on a woman's father's debts, in order to ensure she was not sold to someone who would treat her badly. The most reasonable possible account of an entirely remarkable thing. The bidding took place that afternoon in Whitmore's study. It was conducted with a pretense of formality that I found, frankly, nauseating. Sealed envelopes were distributed. Whitmore had appointed himself the auctioneer of this particular transaction, and he sat behind his desk with his legal man at his elbow, breaking the seals in turn. Lord Voss was present. He sat in the corner with the crumpled look of a man who knows he has done something shameful and has decided the only way forward is not to look at it directly. I found I had very little feeling for him one way or another. Whatever sympathy I might have had was absorbed entirely by his daughter, who was not present, who was, I suspected, in her room, doing what she had told me she did, thinking clearly. Pemberton's bid was submitted first. It was a generous sum, more than generous. The sort of figure that suggested he had wanted this outcome badly enough to prepare for competition. Another gentleman bid higher. There was a murmur in the room. Then Whitmore opened the last envelope. Rennick had not submitted a figure. He had submitted a letter. Whitmore read it. His expression changed twice, first to surprise, then to something that looked almost like discomfort. He cleared his throat. "The Duke of Harthmere bids," he paused. "He bids double the outstanding note." The room went very quiet. "Double," Pemberton said. "Double," Whitmore confirmed. He set the letter down. "He also states, and I quote, that should any gentleman present wish to bid higher, the Duke of Harthmere would consider it a personal affront and would appreciate the opportunity to discuss the matter privately." He looked up. Those are his precise words. Nobody bid higher. I confess that I smiled. I could not help it. It was such a thoroughly Rennick thing to do, to win with money, and with the implicit reminder that he was also the most dangerous man in the room, and to make it sound entirely reasonable. The formal signing took place an hour later. Rennick's solicitor had ridden from the nearest town with remarkable speed, which told me that Rennick had arranged this before we ever left for Whitmore Hall. He had prepared for this. He had come here specifically to do this, and the only thing he had not settled in advance was the precise sum, which he had set at double because he had decided that making the outcome inarguable was worth the cost. I watched Alara Voss sign the documents. She held the pen steadily. She read each page before signing all of them carefully, and once she paused and pointed to a clause and spoke quietly to the solicitor who amended it. I did not hear what she said, but I saw the solicitor's expression, which was one of mild surprise and considerable respect. When it was done, she set down the pen and looked across the table. Rennick was standing near the window. He was looking at her, not at the papers. She met his gaze. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them, something that I, standing 6 feet away, could feel at the edges, the way you feel the warmth of a fire from across a room. Then she nodded, a single, precise inclination of her head. And Rennick Hale, the Ward Duke of Harthmere, who had stood in front of cavalry charges and not moved, inclined his head in return, very slightly, very carefully, as though he were handling something he intended not to break. They were not in love, of course, not yet. That would come later, and it would come slowly and quietly in the way that real things do. Not like the romances in novels, which tend to proceed by crisis and confession and a great unveiling at the end. More like the way a fire establishes itself in a cold room, slowly by degrees, until one morning you notice that the room is warm and you cannot quite say when it became so. In the first weeks, what they were was careful with each other. Harthmere was Rennick's principal estate, a great gray house in the north, solid and ancient, built of stone that had weathered 3 centuries and showed it, with the particular dignity of things that have survived by being too fundamentally sound to fail. The grounds were extensive. A park, a walled garden long neglected, woodlands managed by an elderly forester who had been there longer than anyone could remember, and fields that ran down to a cold river in the valley below. The village that belonged to the estate was modest and well kept, and the people in it, I would come to understand, regarded the Duke of Harthmere with something more nuanced than simple fear or simple loyalty, with the complex regard that comes from long association with a man who is stern and exacting and completely fair, who keeps his promises and demands the same, and who has never in 20 years of holding the estate done anything that could be called mean. The house was warm enough and well managed. Rennick kept a competent staff and paid them fairly, and they rewarded him with loyalty. But it was not, I think, a house that had known a great deal of gentleness in recent years. It was a bachelor's house, in the particular way of bachelors who are not idle, organized with a kind of severe practicality, every room arranged for function, nothing unnecessary, nothing ornamental except what was original to the building and therefore not a choice but a given. The library was the best room, crowded with books in actual use, with papers on the tables and maps on the walls. The dining room was handsome and rarely used. The drawing room had been last redecorated in the previous Duke's time and showed it. Ilara arrived with a single trunk. This fact was noted by the staff with a variety of reactions. Concern from the housekeeper, who had prepared 3 rooms for her things, curiosity from the younger maids, and a kind of quiet recognition from Rennick, who understood at once what a single trunk meant about the nature of what Lord Voss's gambling had left his daughter. She asked to see the household accounts on her second day. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Carroway, looked at her with the skeptical assessment that senior staff apply to new mistresses, and then she brought the accounts, and Ilara sat with them for 3 hours and produced a set of notes so clear and thorough that Mrs. Carroway told Rennick afterward, "I have this from Rennick himself, that Miss Voss, that is, your Grace, has a better head for figures than the estate manager. She corrected 2 errors in the quarterly ledger," Rennick told me when I visited in December. He was standing at the window of his library looking out at the winter grounds. Neither of them large. She left a note for the steward explaining the correction so that he would not feel humiliated. "You sound surprised." "I am not surprised," he said. "I am," he paused, "paying attention." She had by that time also quietly reorganized the flower room, catalogued the neglected library, made friends with the head gardener, and begun teaching the kitchen maid to read, on the grounds that the girl had expressed a wish to, and there was no reason she should not. She had introduced herself to the village vicar and attended his service and donated, quietly, to the parish fund for the poorest families, using the household allowance she had negotiated into the marriage document. She had written to 3 seed merchants about the walled garden and received their catalogues and begun cross-referencing them with the estate's soil records, which she had found in a box in the estate manager's office, and which no one had opened in 7 years. She had done all of this without fanfare, without making anyone feel displaced, and without, as far as I could observe, seeking anyone's approval for any of it. She moved through Harthmere the way water moves through a new space, finding the channels that already existed, following the natural contours, occupying the gaps without forcing anything. What she was not doing, I noticed, was presenting any of it. She did not report her activities to Rennick in the way of a woman seeking acknowledgement. If he asked, and increasingly he did ask, she told him plainly, with the same precision she brought to the household accounts. But she did not volunteer her daily work as evidence of her worth. She seemed entirely not to need his approval, which was, I suspected, precisely why she had it. "Is she happy?" I asked Rennick when I visited him in December. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the winter grounds, and I could see him actually considering the question rather than reaching for an easy answer. "I do not think happiness is a word she uses easily," he said at last. "She told me once that she finds it more useful to ask whether she is purposeful, whether she has something to do that matters." He paused. "She has a great deal to do. She seems not unhappy." A longer pause. "She laughed last week. I hadn't heard it before. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Carroway and the door was open, and she was laughing at something the cook had said, and it was—" He stopped. "It is a good sound," he said, with the simplicity of a man stating an observable fact. "And you?" I asked. He looked at me. "I am paying attention," he said again, and then, "I had not known before what it was like to live in a house where someone else was also paying attention." I thought about that for a while. "She is good for you," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am trying to be worth that." Which was, from Rennick Hale, the most romantic sentence I had ever heard him speak, and I did not say so because he would have found it exasperating. I came to understand, over those winter months, that what I was watching was 2 very serious people discovering, with some astonishment, that they had encountered each other. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people encounter versions of each other, the social version, the careful version, the version that has been groomed for company. What Rennick and Ilara were doing, slowly and without either of them appearing to plan it, was encountering the actual person. This was happening, I think, because they were both too honest for pretense and too intelligent to bother with it. Ilara had spent a year watching careful performance fail her family at every stage, and had decided with the pragmatism that defined her that she would not perform. Rennick had never performed because he found it exhausting, and because, as the Ward Duke of Harthmere, he had not been required to. The role performed for him, and he simply had to not contradict it. What they found, removing the performance, was each other's actual thinking, which turned out to be extraordinarily compatible in the most practical sense, the sense that they arrived at the same conclusions by different routes, and neither of them minded being corrected when the correction was sound, and both of them valued the work of a thing over the appearance of it. Rennick was not accustomed to being met as an equal. This was not arrogance on his part, it was simply the reality of who he was. He was the Ward Duke of Harthmere, feared and respected and kept at a careful distance by the society that depended on his goodwill. Even his friends, I include myself in this, tended to soften our approach to him, to choose our battles, to leave certain silences unquestioned. Ilara did not soften her approach to anything. She was not aggressive about it. She was not unkind. But she spoke her mind with a directness that was, I think, the product of having spent a year watching pretense fail her family at every turn. She had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of her father's debts, that she would not pretend to know less than she did or feel less than she felt, and she saw no reason to make an exception for a duke. I witnessed this directly in January, when I was staying at Harthmere for a fortnight, and the three of us were together at dinner. Rennick had made some remark about the northern tenants, something about a dispute over field boundaries that he proposed to settle in a particular way, the sort of settlement that was administratively clean but would, in my assessment, leave one party aggrieved. Ilara set down her fork. "If you settle it that way," she said, "you will have peace this winter and a fresh dispute in April when the planting begins." Rennick looked at her. "The Halsworth family has farmed that lower quarter for 3 generations," she said. "They know those boundaries better than the survey map. If you draw the line where you propose to draw it, you will be technically correct and practically wrong, and they will know it, and they will resent it in the quiet way that people resent things when they have no power to protest." She picked her fork back up. "If you bring them in and let them show you where the actual boundary post stood before the flood shifted it, you will spend an afternoon and save yourself a year." A silence. Then Rennick said, "How do you know about the flood?" "Mrs. Carroway mentioned it. I asked about the lower quarter when I noticed it wasn't in the autumn rotation." She looked at him calmly. "I ask questions, I find it useful." Another silence, longer this time. Then Rennick said, "I will speak with the Halsworth family on Thursday." She nodded, as though this were simply the sensible conclusion they had both arrived at, and returned to her dinner. I caught Rennick's eye across the table. His expression was entirely undecipherable, which in my experience of him meant that he was feeling something he had not yet catalogued. It was February when I think the turning happened, though I did not witness it directly. I have it from Rennick, told to me later, in the way he told things, baldly, with the feeling present underneath like heat under iron. He had come upon her in the library, late at night. She was sitting on the floor, which surprised him. She did not, as a rule, sit on floors, with a large atlas spread across her knees and a candle held close, and she was tracing one of the maps with her finger with the absorbed concentration of someone following a river upstream to its source. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, she did not start. She simply met his eyes and said, "I have never been further north than the county boundary. I was looking to see where I am on the map of things." He came in and sat on the floor beside her, which he had not planned to do. He looked at the atlas. "You're here," he said, and pointed to a place on the map. Then, after a moment, "I was here in the war." He indicated a location further east across the border. "And here afterward." She looked at where his finger rested and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Were you frightened?" He told me he had not been asked that before. Not directly. Not by anyone who seemed to actually want the true answer rather than a reassuring one. Men asked if he was well, which was a question about whether one was functional. They asked if the campaign had been difficult, which was a question about logistics. Nobody had asked whether he was frightened, which was a question about the interior of a man. He said yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then she said, "I think it requires more courage to be frightened and continue than to simply not feel it. I have always thought that." A pause. "My father is not a frightened man as a rule. He does not apprehend consequences clearly enough to be frightened. I have sometimes thought it would have been better if he had been." Rennick looked at her. She was still looking at the map, tracing the border again with her finger, and her face in the candlelight was composed and calm and, he told me, startlingly young. He had understood her to be capable, which had led him to also think of her as somehow solid, unmovable. The candle made her look like a girl with an atlas, which she was, and which he had somehow not quite seen before. She looked up and met his eyes and did not look away, which she never did. "I am glad you survived it," she said, not performed warmth, just the plain fact stated. He told me that sitting on the library floor with an atlas in the candlelight, he had felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was clenched there. He had described the sensation, with some difficulty, as like a door that had been locked, and then very quietly unlocked, not thrown open, just unlocked and left ajar. That was all he said about it. But he said it the way men say things that have cost them something to admit, and I believed him entirely. They stayed on the library floor for another hour. He could not remember afterward what else they had spoken about, which was unusual for him, because his memory was exceptional. What he remembered was the candlelight and the atlas and the sense of having been, for the first time in a long time, in the presence of someone with whom silence was comfortable rather than merely empty. I should say, before I come to March, something about the winter itself. It was a hard winter. The north of the county took the worst of it, sustained frost from December through the end of February, with 2 significant snowfalls that blocked the lower roads and brought the village into the kind of quiet crisis that rural communities manage with a combination of practicality and stubborn dignity. The Harthmere estate was well prepared. Rennick had been rigorous about winter provisioning for years, and the tenants and villagers who depended on the estate's support had that support reliably. What none of them had expected was the Duchess of Harthmere appearing at the village twice a week throughout December and January, driving herself in the estate's smaller carriage. She had refused the larger ceremonial one on the grounds that it was impractical for village roads, with Mrs. Caraway and whatever practical provisions she had identified as needed. This was not performance. She did not bring an audience or expect acknowledgement. She brought preserved food and warm cloth, and once, a physician she had arranged from the town when 3 families came down with a coughing sickness at once, which she had identified early and moved on before it became serious. Rennick found out about the physician from the village apothecary, who was grateful and slightly bewildered, and from his steward, who reported that Her Grace has been keeping her own account of the village families and their situations. He found out about the twice-weekly visits from Mrs. Caraway, who told him with the air of a woman delivering information she considers her employer ought to have had sooner. He said nothing to Alara directly for a fortnight. Then, on a Sunday after church, when they were walking back along the south path, they had taken to walking on Sundays, in the careful, companionable way of 2 people who are choosing each other's company without making a ceremony of the choice. He said, "The apothecary tells me the Meldrew family's youngest has recovered." She glanced at him. Yes, the physician caught it in time. "The physician you arranged." Mrs. Caraway was concerned. I agreed with her. He was quiet for a moment. They walked in the thin winter sunshine, their breath making clouds in the cold air. "The steward says you have been keeping a household account for the village families." "Someone should," she said. "It is easier to help when you know what is needed before it becomes urgent." He stopped walking. She walked 2 more steps before she realized and turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that she told me, much later, she could not quite read in the moment. Something between astonishment and recognition. Something that looked, from the outside, like a man encountering a fact he had not fully expected to encounter. "My mother did something like that," he said at last. "She kept a book. I hadn't thought of it in years." Alara was quiet for a moment. "Is that all right?" "Yes," he said. "It is, yes." He seemed to collect himself. He began walking again. "Thank you," he said. She fell into step beside him. "You don't need to thank me for managing the household." "I'm not thanking you for managing the household," he said. "I am thanking you for," he paused. "For doing it the way she did," he said, and left it at that. Which was enough. It was, knowing Rennick, a very great deal. What broke the careful distance between them in the end was not a grand gesture. It was not a ball or a declaration or a public moment. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and it was about the garden. She had been working with the head gardener, a quiet man named Drews who had been at Harthmere for 20 years, and who had, in those 20 years, never been asked for his opinion by anyone of consequence. Alara had asked for his opinion on the first day she met him, and he had given her 3 hours of accumulated knowledge about the walled garden with the fervent relief of a man who had been waiting to be asked. They had together drawn up a plan for the walled garden's restoration. It was a modest plan, practical and achievable, making use of what was already there. Alara had presented it to Rennick on a Tuesday morning because that was when he reviewed estate matters, and she saw no reason to treat the garden differently from anything else. He had read the plan twice through, very carefully. Then he had looked up at her and said, "This would require 3 additional staff." "2," she said. "I spoke with the nursery in the village. They have 2 boys who are willing to apprentice at fair terms. Drews has agreed to train them." She paused. "The 3rd I thought if you were willing, Drew's nephew, who has been out of work since the mill closed." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You have already spoken to all of them." "I wanted to be sure the proposal was practical before I brought it to you," she said. "There is no point presenting a plan that cannot be executed." He set the paper down. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she glanced up at him, checking his expression the way one checks the weather, not anxiously, but with the clear-eyed attention she brought to everything. "Alara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She had not asked him to. He had simply used it, and it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. She waited. "The plan is approved," he said. "All 3 staff the terms you've arranged beginning at the end of the month." He paused. "And I would like, if you are willing, to walk through the walled garden with you this afternoon, so that you can show me what it will be." She looked at him for a moment with those winter sky eyes, and I cannot say what she saw there because I was not present. But I think she saw what I had seen from the beginning, a man who was very serious about things he considered worth his seriousness, and who had quietly, without announcing it, decided that she was worth his. "I would be glad to," she said. They walked in the walled garden for 2 hours. This I know, because Mrs. Carroway told me, with the satisfied air of a woman who had been waiting for this particular development and was gratified to see it arrive. I visited Harthmere again in April, when the garden work was underway and the first things were beginning to grow. What I found was not a dramatic change. It was something quieter and, to my mind, more remarkable, a household that had become, simply and unmistakably, a home. Rennick met me in the entrance hall himself, which he had never done before. He had staff for that, and in the past would have appeared in the library or the study, absorbed in some document. He looked, I searched for the word and settled on, lighter. Not in the sense of carelessness, but in the sense of a man who has put down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. He said, "She's in the garden. She'll be irritated if I don't take you straight there." He said she, with a naturalness that told me everything. The walled garden was transformed, not finished, not yet, but alive in a way it had not been. The beds were turned and planted. The old pear trees had been carefully pruned. There were seedlings in careful rows, and Drews was explaining something to his nephew, and at the far end of the garden, on her knees in the earth with her gloves on and a smear of soil on her cheek, was Alara Voss, Alara Hale. Now, since the marriage had been made final in January, though she had not, I noticed, changed the way she moved through a room, which was still with quiet purpose and not a particle of pretension. She looked up when she heard us, and her face did something I had not seen it do at Whitmore Hall. She smiled, not the careful, composed expression of a woman in armor. A real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere uncalculated. She stood up and pulled off her gloves and came toward us, and Rennick, who was the most composed man I had ever known in 40 years of knowing him, watched her cross the garden toward him with an expression on his face that was so naked and uncloaked that I looked away out of something very close to reverence. Society had not been kind in the intervening months. I should record that, because it would be incomplete to leave it out, and because Alara handled it in a way that still makes me proud of her, which is a strange feeling to have about a woman I have known less than a year. Word had spread, of course. These things always do. The marriage auction at Whitmore Hall was not precisely a secret. There had been 7 witnesses, and at least 3 of them had the kind of mouths that find other people's business irresistible. By February, it was known in the drawing rooms of the county that the Ward Duke of Harthmere had acquired a wife at something very close to a sale, and that the wife was a nobody, a debtor's daughter. untitled, without fortune or connection, plain in looks and obscure in origin. Lady Pemberton, the mother of the young man who had bid and lost, made it her particular project to ensure that Alara felt the full weight of this judgment. At the county assembly in March, she had arranged, with the precision of a military campaign, to ensure that Alara was pointedly excluded from 3 consecutive conversations, that her gown was publicly remarked upon as charming for the circumstances, and that a remark about trade wives was made at sufficient volume to be audible across the room. I know this because I was there, and because I was watching Alara, and because Alara did not flinch. She stood and listened to the remark about trade wives with the same composed attention she brought to household accounts, and then she turned to Lady Pemberton and said, in a clear and pleasant voice, "Lady Pemberton, I believe you attended the assembly at Grenmore 2 years ago. I thought the floral arrangements were particularly fine. Did you have a role in their organization?" Lady Pemberton, confounded by a question that demanded a civil answer, gave one. Alara listened with every appearance of interest, and then made one very precise observation about the difficulty of arranging flowers in winter, which was accurate and unremarkable, and which somehow, without any apparent effort, shifted the conversation entirely away from trade wives and onto ground where she was perfectly comfortable, and Lady Pemberton was now obliged to be pleasant or reveal herself as deliberately rude. Lady Pemberton chose pleasant. I told this to Rennick afterward in the carriage. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "She is better at this than I am." "Most people are better at this than you are," I said. "Yes," he agreed without rancor. "I generally prefer to make it clear that I am the most dangerous person in the room. And she prefers to make it clear that she is the most capable one." He looked at me, then he said slowly, as though the thought were still forming, "Between the 2 of us we might be manageable." I did not laugh. I wanted to, but I did not, because he was not making a joke. He was making, in his particular way, the closest thing to a declaration that I expected to hear from him at that stage, the admission that he had begun to think of them as a we, as a unit with complementary qualities, as something that functioned differently and perhaps better than either of them functioned alone. He said nothing more. The carriage went on. Outside the windows, the March countryside ran by, still pale from the winter and just beginning to show the first tentative signs of the season turning. After a while, Alara, who was sitting across from us with her gloves in her lap and her gaze on the window, said, "Lady Pemberton's flowers were artificial, in the dining room, in February." There was a pause. "Were they?" I said. "The arrangement near the east window, the roses. No fresh rose looks like that in February. There was no natural color in them, and the stems were wire." She turned from the window. "I noticed when I sat down. I mention it only because she remarked on my sprigged muslin as practical for winter." It seemed relevant context. Rennick looked at her. She looked back at him with the calm, direct gaze she had given him since the first dinner at Whitmore Hall. And then, for the first time in my acquaintance with the Ward Duke of Harthmere, a span of 30 years in which I had not once heard him laugh, he did. It was not a loud laugh, or a long one. It was the brief, genuine laugh of a man who has been surprised into it by something that has delighted him entirely. He covered it almost immediately and looked back out the window. Alara turned back to the window herself, and if there was something in the corners of her expression that was satisfied, she was too restrained to make it obvious. I sat between them in the carriage and thought about how the world contains these moments, small, quiet, uncelebrated, in which 2 people discover that they are funny to each other, and how that discovery matters more than most of the large occasions that precede it. The evening that I believe sealed it, though these things do not seal on a single evening, they accumulate like interest, was in April, the same visit, when I was staying at Harthmere for a week. There was a letter. It arrived from London, from one of the old families who had business dealings with Harthmere, and it was addressed to Alara. I happened to be present when she opened it in the morning room, and I saw her read it and then set it down. "Trouble?" I asked. "Lord Whitmore," she said. "He is in London and has apparently been making remarks." She looked at the letter. "He implies in rather elegant language that the manner of our marriage reflects poorly on the Duke's judgment, that a man of Harthmere's standing ought to have chosen better." She paused. "He seems to feel that the details of the auction in light of subsequent events would make a diverting anecdote for the season." I understood immediately what was being implied. Whitmore, stung perhaps by some slight or simply in pursuit of entertainment, proposed to make the story fashionable, to turn it into the season's scandal. A duke who bought his wife at auction, the wife who had been sold. It was, from a certain cruel angle, precisely the kind of story that drawing rooms devoured. "Does Rennick know?" I asked. "Not yet." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. "I am deciding whether to tell him in a way that simply informs him or in a way that accurately conveys that I am—" She paused. "Angry," she said at last. "I am angry. I do not become angry often, and I find it inconvenient." "What are you angry about?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "I am angry," she said precisely, "that Lord Whitmore believes this story diminishes me, because I do not believe it diminishes me. I know exactly what I did at Whitmore Hall. I read every page of the document before I signed it. I negotiated one clause in my own favor, which the solicitor agreed to because it was reasonable. I have managed Harthmere's household for 5 months and improved the lower quarterly accounts by a margin that would surprise several of the gentlemen who considered me a bad bargain." She set the letter down. "And I am angry that a man who organized a marriage auction and profited from it feels entitled to tell other people that the auction reflects poorly on someone else." I looked at her for a long moment. "You should tell Rennick exactly that," I said. She looked at me. "Exactly as you said it to me," I said. "All of it, including the anger." She did tell him. I know because I was in the library when she came to find him, and I excused myself, and then I remained in the hall because I am not ashamed to say I wanted to know what happened, and the door was not entirely closed. She told him about the letter. She told him what Whitmore proposed to do. She told him she was angry. And then she said, "I want you to know that I am not asking you to protect me from this. I am quite capable of managing Lord Whitmore's story on my own terms if that becomes necessary. I am telling you because it involves you, and you should be informed." There was a long silence. Then Rennick said, "Will you give me the letter?" "Why?" "Because Lord Whitmore and I have a long-standing arrangement," Rennick said, "in which I do not involve myself in his business and he does not involve himself in mine. He has broken that arrangement. I intend to remind him of it." A pause. "In writing." "A letter is sufficient." "From me," Rennick said, "yes." Another pause. Then Alara said, "I negotiated a clause in the marriage document in my own favor." "I know," Rennick said. "My solicitor told me. The clause about managing household funds independently. He said it was entirely reasonable and he had agreed to it immediately." A pause. "He also said he'd never seen a bride read the complete document before signing." "It seemed sensible," she said. "It is sensible," Rennick said. "Everything about you is sensible." Another pause, and then his voice shifted, not louder, not softer, but with something underneath it that had not been there a moment before. "I want you to know because you have been careful with me, and I have been careful with you, and I think perhaps we have been too careful. I want you to know that the price I paid at Whitmore Hall was not a sacrifice. It was—" He stopped. I held my breath in the hall. "It was the most straightforward decision I have made in a long time," he said. "You have made this house, you have made my—" He stopped again. Then, "I am not eloquent." "You are perfectly clear," she said quietly. A silence, a long one. Then she said, "Rennick." It was the first time, I think, that she had used his given name. I could hear the deliberateness of it. "Yes," he said. "I find that I am glad I signed those papers," she said. "All of them. Including the clause I negotiated." I went back to the library and closed the door behind me and sat in a chair for a while, feeling, in the particular way of a man who has known his friend for 30 years, and watched him be lonely for most of them, something very like relief. I was not present in London 2 months later, when the matter of Lord Whitmore came to its conclusion. I heard about it from 3 separate people before I arrived in town, which gives you some indication of how thoroughly it was remarked upon. Rennick had, as promised, written to Whitmore. The letter, I am told, was brief, cordial in tone, and entirely unambiguous in implication. Whitmore had, apparently, decided to disregard it, which was a miscalculation on his part, because Rennick was a man who said exactly what he meant, and what he meant was that he would not tolerate his wife being made into a drawing-room anecdote. The occasion was a dinner at Lord and Lady Marston's, one of the great houses of the season, attended by essentially everyone. Whitmore had apparently begun his version of the Whitmore Hall story at the table. I am told he had refined it quite prettily, with comic timing and a light touch of scandal, when Rennick set down his wine glass. He waited until the table was quiet. Then he said, in the pleasant voice of a man making a factual observation, "Lord Whitmore has been kind enough to share an anecdote involving Harthmere. In the spirit of accuracy, I should add a detail he has omitted." He looked at Whitmore directly. "My wife read every page of the marriage document before she signed it. She negotiated a clause in her own interest because she is more thorough than the men who thought they were purchasing an advantage. She has run Harthmere's household for 7 months. She restored the walled garden. She settled a boundary dispute that had been unresolved for 2 decades. He paused. "She has also, in that time, declined every opportunity to make anyone at Whitmore Hall, including Lord Whitmore, feel small." He picked up his wine glass again. "I mention this because if Lord Whitmore wishes to discuss the auction, he will need to include the part where my wife was the most capable person in the room." "I am happy to elaborate." The silence at the table, by all accounts, lasted for quite some time. Whitmore did not tell the story again. And Alara, who had been at the far end of the table and who later told me she had heard every word, sat with her spine straight and her hands still in her lap, and the expression on her face. This I have on reliable authority from Lady Marston herself, who was seated beside her, was not triumph, and not relief, and not performance. It was, Lady Marston said, the expression of a woman who is being seen, precisely and completely by exactly the person she has permitted to see her. Lady Marston added, because she is a woman of considerable perception, that she had been to many dinners in many years, and she had never seen a man look at his wife the way the Ward Duke of Harthmere looked at his wife across that table. As though she were the only thing in the room worth looking at, she said. I told her that she was right, and that it had been so from the beginning, even if it took them both a little while to know it. I was the witness at their second ceremony. It was not a legal requirement. They were already married, bound by the papers signed at Whitmore Hall. But Rennick had said in the spring that he wished to do it again. Properly, he said, which was an unusual word for him to use, given that he tended to insist that things were either accurate or inaccurate, not proper or improper. And Alara had looked at him for a long moment and said yes. It was a small ceremony. The chapel at Harthmere, which had not been used for a wedding in a generation, was cleaned and quietly decorated, not by hired staff brought in for the occasion, but by Alara and Mrs. Carroway and the head gardener Drews and his nephew, over the course of a week, with flowers from the walled garden. There were perhaps 20 people present, no spectacle, no society audience, no one to perform for. Rennick read the vows in the level voice he used for things that mattered greatly to him, which is to say without emphasis or decoration, because he did not need either. When he placed the ring on her finger, a ring she had not had from the first marriage, there had been no occasion for one. His hands were entirely steady. Alara said her vows looking at him, not at the book. She had always had a good memory. Afterward, when the register was signed, and the small gathering had moved to the dining room for a celebration that was warm and informal, and entirely unlike a society event, I found myself standing with Rennick at the edge of the room, watching Alara talk to Mrs. Carroway with the easy warmth of two people who have arrived at genuine regard for each other. You were right, I said. About what? He was watching her. In the garden at Whitmore Hall, when you said she had not flinched once, I paused. You recognized something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I recognized someone who did not require permission to be worthy of respect. He glanced at me. It occurred to me that I had been living in a house of considerable size for a considerable number of years, and that no one in it had ever corrected my steward's accounts, or argued with me about boundary disputes, or sat on the library floor at midnight looking at a map. A pause. I found I did not want to live without those things. I nodded. We stood together in companionable silence, as we had done for most of our lives. Then I said, You told a room full of London society that your wife was the most capable person at the auction. It was accurate, he said. Whitmore looked as though he had swallowed something unpleasant. Good, he picked up a glass from a passing tray and looked at it briefly. She told me afterward that she wished I hadn't, that she was capable of managing her own battles. What did you say? I told her she was right, he said. I also told her that managing her battles and wanting to stand beside her while she managed them were not mutually exclusive. A pause. She considered that for approximately 30 seconds and then said it was logical. I laughed. She also said, he added, with a quality in his voice that I had not heard in 30 years of friendship, something quiet and certain and deeply content, that she was glad I had been at Whitmore Hall, not because of what I paid, but because I came. He looked across the room at her. She was smiling at something Mrs. Carroway had said, and in the light of the afternoon through the long windows of the dining room, she was not what society had called plain, and never had been. She was the kind of person who became more visible as you looked, and once you had looked you did not wish to look away. I would have come, Rennick said, from a good deal further than Whitmore Hall. I am an old man now, as I tell this, and I have seen a great many things. I have seen marriages made for money that remained marriages only for money, and I have seen marriages made for love that burned through love and left nothing. I have seen alliances and accommodations, and very occasionally, rarely enough that I count each one, something true. What Rennick and Alara made in that first difficult year, out of debt and desperation, and an auction and an atlas on a library floor, was something true. It was not easy, and it was not instant, and it was not without the friction of two serious people who are accustomed to their own counsel and not inclined to be managed. It was built argument by argument and morning by morning, and one negotiated document clause at a time. It was built in the walled garden and the village road, and the library at midnight, and the county assembly rooms, and a carriage in March, where a man laughed for the first time in too long at a woman who had noticed that Lady Pemberton's roses were made of wire. It was built on the particular and unromantic foundation of two people who saw each other clearly, and having seen, chose to continue looking. I think about Whitmore Hall sometimes, and the men who sat in that room and looked at Alara Voss and saw a transaction, a debt discharged, a modest piece of breeding in a manageable package. I think about how thoroughly they misread what they were seeing, because what was actually in front of them was a woman of extraordinary capacity who had been placed, by her father's failure, in the worst possible circumstances, and who had met those circumstances with a composure and a clarity that left every man in the room, except one, entirely mistaken about what they were dealing with. Rennick was not mistaken. He looked at her at that dinner table and saw what I have tried to describe, a person doing something very difficult with great dignity and no audience and no particular expectation of rescue. He rescued her anyway, and then, having done so, he had the good sense to step back and let her be exactly what she already was. That is the secret of it, I think, if there is a secret, not the rescue itself, not the dramatic bid and the silenced room and the double the outstanding note. Those were necessary. Without them, she would have been given to a man who would have made her life very small, but the rescue was only the beginning. What came after was the part that mattered. The Tuesday mornings in March, and the boundary dispute in the lower field, and the atlas on the library floor, and the sound of her laughing with Mrs. Carroway with the kitchen door open. The part where the Ward Duke of Harthmere came home to a house that had become a home, and found it was a better thing than he had known a house could be. But I have never, in all my years of knowing the Ward Duke of Harthmere, seen him look the way he looks when she walks into a room. And I have never, in the months I have known Alara Hale, seen her composure more beautifully itself than when she looks back at him. That is the whole of it, that is the story. The girl they sold for a debt became the woman who restored the walled garden and balanced the accounts, and corrected the steward and argued about boundaries, and sat on library floors with atlases, and taught a kitchen maid to read, and outmaneuvered Lady Pemberton at a county assembly without raising her voice once. And the man who paid double for her, who had walked through cannon fire and never flinched, who frightened drawing rooms and parliaments alike, who was made of iron and solitude and impeccable, exhausting duty, that man went home to her every evening, and was, by every measure I have ever been able to apply, the luckier of the two. End of story, entry 11 *. Word count target, ~11 200 words.